I just don't think this is working anymore.
Are you saying what I think you're saying?
The glass walls of Gate 7 shimmered in the morning light, each pane reflecting the chaos of the private terminal. Uniformed staff gliding past with silver luggage carts, the muted clink of champagne glasses from the VIP lounge, the quiet roar of departing jets beyond the runway. Victor Hale moved through it all like he always did, commanding the space without trying. Tailored navy suit, gold cufflinks, an easy stride that announced wealth the way cologne announced presence. He'd just wrapped a week in Zurich, closing a deal worth more than the GDP of some countries. The jet lag hadn't touched him. Nothing ever did. Until it did, he saw her. She was stepping down the staircase of a sleek black Gulfstream, sunlight catching on the silver pins in her hair. Amara. The name detonated in his head before his brain could form words. For a moment, the sound in the terminal collapsed into silence. Her skin was the deep, rich brown he remembered tracing with his fingertips in another lifetime. The curve of her jaw, the elegant slope of her neck, it was all the same. But she carried herself differently now. Straighter, unshakable. Her tailored cream trench coat swung around her legs as she moved. And then, God, he saw them point. 3 small figures clung to her hands and the hem of her coat. The triplets, boys. All of them. Same tight curls, same eyes, his eyes. That exact gray that never softened. Even in photographs, that IT was impossible. It was undeniable. One of the boys tilted his head to look up at her, lips parting to ask something, and Victor's lungs stopped working. The way his eyebrows lifted, it was exactly the way Victor's had in his own childhood photos. Sir? A voice broke through. His assistant, Jordan, hovered beside him, holding a leather portfolio. We should head to. Victor's hand went up, silencing him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Amara looked up. Her gaze met his across the wide glass space. And for a second, neither of them blinked. The air between them thickened, a rope pulled taut over years of absence and unspoken fury. Then, just as quickly, she looked away. That IT was a dismissal, clean and deliberate. She adjusted her grip on the smallest boy's hand and began walking toward the passport control desk without breaking stride. Victor's pulse pounded in his ears. He started forward before he'd even decided to. Amara. She didn't turn. Amara. Louder this time, the name cutting through the low hum of the lounge. A few people glanced over, recognizing him. No doubt, though probably not her. Her voice came without her head turning. Don't. The single word hit harder than a slap. When she finally did face him, her expression was unreadable. No warmth, no open anger, just the kind of icy composure that made his gut twist. You have 3 seconds before I walk away, she said. Her voice was lower than he remembered, smoother, with an edge that hadn't been there before. What? His throat tightened. They're mine. The corner of her mouth lifted, but it wasn't a smile. You don't get to. Ask me that. His eyes flicked to the children. 2 were studying the floor tiles with casual curiosity, but the smallest was staring directly at him, studying him. The boy tilted his head again. The gesture was so achingly familiar it made Victor's chest ache. I didn't even know. No, Amara cut in. You didn't care to know. The words landed like a blade between his ribs. Around them, the terminal continued its quiet dance. Champagne flutes clinking, luggage wheels gliding over polished marble, an airport announcer's soft voice overhead. You would have done exactly what you did, she said, her gaze burning into him. Left, built your empire, replaced me with the next polished thing on your arm. Victor's jaw tightened. That's not fair. You want fair, she said, almost laughing. Fair would have been you at my side when I was sick in the 3rd trimester. Fair would have been a father in the delivery room. Fair would have been you answering one damn phone call. Her voice hadn't risen, but somehow it carried. Slicing through the air, he stepped closer, lowering his own tone. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew what you'd do with the information, she said, her eyes glinting. And I wasn't going to let you turn my children into a press release. The tallest boy tugged at her coat. Mama, he whispered, we're hungry. Her face softened instantly as she crouched down to meet his eyes. We'll eat soon, baby, she murmured, brushing a curl from his forehead. Then, without looking at Victor, she rose and started toward the customs desk again. Amara, wait. She didn't stop, but her stride slowed enough for him to catch up. "I need to talk to you," he said, voice low. "Just us." She looked at him then, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the plane, something flickered in her eyes. Not softness, but a deep, aching anger. "You had your chance," she said. "You don't get another one." The customs officer waved her forward. She handed over 4 passports without hesitation, her nails perfectly manicured, her wrists steady. Victor stood just behind, close enough to smell her perfume, a scent he hadn't caught in years, still capable of undoing him in seconds. The officer glanced at the documents, then at the children, then at her. "Welcome home, ma'am." Home, the word punched through Victor's chest. She was back. The triplets followed her through, their small sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Amara's coat swayed with each step, a quiet, steady rhythm that matched her breathing. Victor didn't move until they were nearly out of sight, swallowed by the next corridor. "Sir?" Jordan's voice came again, hesitant. "Your car is waiting." Victor turned his head slowly, his mind a cyclone of images. Amara's face under the harsh courtroom lights he'd already begun to imagine, the triplets' matching eyes staring up at him, the headline possibilities racing like wildfire. His voice was almost a whisper, meant more for himself than for Jordan. "Find out everything." The sound of Victor's voice still clung to Amara like a scent she couldn't scrub away. Even hours later, after the customs officer had stamped their passports and the children had fallen asleep in the back seat of the taxi, she could still hear it, sharp and disbelieving, as if her very existence was an inconvenience he hadn't accounted for. She stared out the tinted window at the city sliding past. Billboards, glass towers, neon restaurant signs, all the markers of the life she used to know. The life she had burned down. It had been 6 years since she last stood on American soil. 6 years since she'd boarded a flight in the dead of night, her belly swollen under a loose sweater, clutching a single suitcase that contained her passport, her grandmother's gold bracelet, and the resignation letter she hadn't had the dignity to send in person. Victor hadn't been there to see her leave. He'd been at some charity gala that night, hand on the waist of a 24-year-old socialite who wore Victor's mother's diamonds like she'd been born to them. The photographs had been everywhere, magazines, gossip blogs, even her own inbox when a well-meaning friend sent her a "you need to see this" message. She hadn't needed to see it. She'd already known. The sacrifice before Victor Hale. Amara had been a rising curator at one of New York's most respected art museums. Her days were spent with canvases and sculptures, her nights in small wine bars with colleagues who argued passionately about the merits of movements and mediums. Then Victor walked in. He'd come for a private tour, all charm and curiosity, asking her questions about brushstrokes and pigment like he genuinely cared. By the end of the night, he had her number. By the end of the month, he had her heart. When they married, too. Years later, she left the museum. "We'll build something bigger together," he'd promised, convincing her that curating his growing art collection and hosting galas would be a more impactful use of her talents. She told herself it was temporary, that she was investing in their shared dream, but it was never their dream. It was his. The Circle Victor's world was marble floors, private jets, and a network of people whose net worths could bankrupt small nations. It was also a world where Amara was always slightly out of place. The first time she heard one of his associates refer to her as exotic, she laughed politely, thinking it was ignorance rather than insult. The second time, she corrected them. The third, she realized it wasn't ignorance. It was intent. At tea dinners, she noticed how Victor's colleagues' wives exchanged glances when she entered a room. The comments were subtle but sharp. "Your skin is just so unique under this lighting. You must be so grateful Victor found you." She never told him about the worst of it. The overheard remark that she was a diversity asset for his image, the way a board member's wife had once patted her hair without asking. Victor didn't see it. Or maybe he chose not to. The breaking point the night it all shattered. They'd been preparing for the annual Hale Foundation Gala. Amara had spent weeks overseeing every detail. The floral arrangements, the silent auction items, the seating chart designed to avoid the petty feuds between wealthy donors. She was in the dressing room when her phone buzzed with a news alert. A grainy photo of Victor leaving a rooftop bar, his hand on the small of another woman's back. The headline called her a rising star in Manhattan society. Amara confronted him in their penthouse kitchen. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling more from exhaustion than rage. Victor didn't even flinch. "Don't make this a scene. We have guests arriving in 2 hours. You're sleeping with her?" He poured himself a drink, his cufflinks glinting under the pendant lights. "You've been distracted lately." "Distracted?" she echoed, incredulous. "I've been running your life, Victor. Your events. Your image. While you—" He cut her off with a sharp gesture. "This isn't working, Amara. It's better if we end it now before it gets ugly." It was already ugly. The goodbye no one saw. She didn't cry when she left. She didn't throw anything, didn't beg. She simply packed the essentials and booked a ticket to Paris, where an old friend from her museum days offered her a spare room. In the weeks that followed, the divorce papers arrived with mechanical efficiency. His lawyers were as polished as they were ruthless, pushing for a settlement that erased her from his life as neatly as a brushstroke painted over a canvas. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom counter for 2 days before she could look at it. Again, when she finally did, the result was still there, bold and undeniable. She told no one the isolation Paris was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it was survival. Her mornings were spent teaching English to art students. Afternoons were for rest, if you could call the constant nausea rest. She avoided mirrors, unable to look at the woman who had traded her career for a man's empire and ended up with nothing but a growing belly and a stack of unpaid bills. The triplets came early. The hospital room was a blur of beeping machines, nurses speaking rapid French, and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. When they placed the first baby in her arms, she thought her chest might burst. When they placed the second, she began to cry. By the third, she was laughing and sobbing at the same time. She named them after artists who had fought their own wars against obscurity. The rebuilding years passed. She learned to braid 3 heads of hair before school, learned how to stretch a week's worth of groceries into 10 days, learned how to keep the boys' questions about their father at bay with stories about a man who loved the world so much he had to see all of it. She opened a small art gallery in Marseille, showcasing emerging African and Caribbean artists. It was enough to pay the bills, enough to keep her independence, enough to prove to herself, if no one else, that she didn't need Victor Hale, and she meant it. For years, she meant it. The vow. There were nights, after the boys had gone to bed, when she'd sit by the window with a glass of wine and think about him. Not about the love they'd had. She refused to romanticize that, but about the sheer audacity of his absence. She vowed never to let him back in, never to need him, never to give him the satisfaction of knowing what he had missed. When she saw him at the airport today, older, still handsome, still carrying himself like the world belonged to him, her first instinct wasn't to run. It was to stand taller. She hadn't come back for him. She'd come back because the gallery had outgrown its walls, because the boys deserved to know their grandmother, because she had built something worth bringing home. And if Victor thought for a second that this was his second chance, he was about to learn that some bridges weren't just burned, they were reduced to ash. The Marseille gallery had always smelled faintly of oil paint and sea air. Even now, years later, Amara still found comfort in unlocking the heavy wooden door each morning, flipping the lights on, and letting the morning sun spill across the canvases. It was small. 3 rooms, pale walls, polished concrete floors, but it was hers. On most days, she could hear the boys upstairs in the apartment above, their laughter carrying through the floorboards as they chased each other before school. Her life had become a rhythm. Open the gallery, walk the boys to school, arrange a new installation, close up by 6, dinner, homework, bedtime stories, wine and silence. After it was simple, predictable, and exactly how she liked it. The only unpredictable thing was the question. The question, it came in different forms, but it was always the same. Man, what does our daddy do? Why don't we have a daddy like Max at school? Or, more recently, from strangers in hushed curiosity, they look just like someone I've seen. Amara had never lied outright. She just never told the whole truth, as she'd always said she would explain it when they were old enough to understand. But she knew that when that day came, it wouldn't be a gentle conversation. It would be a storm. The night she knew, the memory came back in flashes. Even now, it was late, well past midnight, when she first suspected. Victor had been away on a business trip for nearly a week, and she'd been alone in the penthouse, pacing the polished marble floors while rain tapped against the glass. Her period was late, but she'd brushed it off. Stress, travel, anything but the thing she secretly hoped for. She sat on the cool bathroom tile, pregnancy test on the counter, the sound of the rain muffled by the glass walls. She told herself she wouldn't look until the timer went off. She looked anyway. 2 lines. Clear. Bold, she'd cried then, not out of fear, but out of a rush of something fierce and certain. She'd imagined telling Victor, the way his eyes might light up, the way he might pull her close and say, "We're going to do this together." The very next evening, she saw the photographs. Victor, tuxedoed, hand on the waist of the socialite. The same one who'd been at the gala. The same one people had whispered about. The headline had been merciless. Billionaire hails new flame? She didn't need confirmation. The story had already been written. The silence, when Victor returned, she'd been ready to tell him anyway, determined to push through the betrayal and salvage something. But he'd walked in with the same dismissive tone as before, discussing time apart and clean breaks, as if she were a project he'd finished. That she'd stood in the kitchen, hands pressed against her still flat stomach, and said nothing. That if he could leave her without asking a single question, then he didn't deserve the answer she held. She'd made her choice in that moment, not out of spite, but out of protection. Protection for herself, for the life she was already growing, and for the children who would never be a pawn in Victor Hale's public image. The cover leaving had been easy in the logistical sense. She still had contacts in Europe from her museum days. A former colleague in Paris offered her a room. She told Victor's lawyers she was relocating for personal reasons and declined any alimony, with a curt signature in no paper trail. No photographs, no updates. When the boys were born, 2 months early, her name was the only one on the birth certificates. She never once sent a photo to New York. The triplets became her secret, and she guarded them like the most valuable piece. In her gallery, the years between raising them alone had been relentless. There were days when she worked the gallery floor with a baby strapped to her chest, another in a bassinet behind the counter, and the third in the care of a neighbor for just long enough to get through a client meeting. But the boys grew, healthy, loud, and endlessly curious. By the time they were 5, they could name most of the paintings in the gallery, could tell the difference between a Van Gogh and a Gauguin with startling accuracy. Her customers adored them. Her artists adored them even more. And yet, every so often, she would catch one of them making a face, a tilt of the head, a half smile. That was pure Victor. And something in her chest would tighten. The whisper network. She wasn't naive. She knew whispers had followed her. The resemblance was too strong, the timing too suspicious. But Marseille was not New York, and its art world was small enough to keep secrets if it wanted to. A wealthy American collector had once studied the boys too long during an opening night and said, "You know, they remind me of..." He hadn't finished the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. Amara had smiled politely and excused herself. The hardest part, what she didn't say to anyone, not even her closest friend, was that she had once, in a moment of weakness, thought about calling him. It was during a fever scare when the boys were 2, all 3 of them burning with heat, crying in the night, the French words of the emergency nurse blurring in her panic. She'd held the phone in her hand and imagined his voice on the other end. Imagined telling him, "They're yours," but she didn't. By morning, the fevers had broken. And so had her temptation, the present reckoning now. Sitting in her Marseille apartment, suitcase half-packed for the move, she thought about that choice. Again, if Victor had looked at her in the airport today with regret, she might have felt some measure of vindication. But no, what she'd seen was something else. Shock, yes, but also the calculation. She knew too well that he wasn't thinking about her. He was thinking about control. The boys didn't know what had happened between them. They only knew that they had her, and that had always been enough. She intended to keep it that way. The truth of their paternity was hers to give or never give. And if Victor Hale thought he could take it from her now, he was about to discover the same thing she decided 6 years ago in that marble kitchen. Some truths don't belong to you, no matter how much money you have. It started with a single shutter click. The photographer hadn't even been looking for them. He was camped at the private terminal to catch a rumored celebrity divorcee arriving from Milan. Instead, His lens caught Victor Hale, frozen mid-step, staring like a man seeing a ghost. The second frame captured Amara, elegant in her cream trench coat, her head turned just enough to reveal the striking planes of her face. The third caught the triplets. It took less than an hour for the first blurry shots to hit a gossip blog. The caption was pure bait. Victor Hale stunned at airport. Who is the mysterious woman with 3 look-alike children? The internet smells blood by mid-morning. Hashtags were trending. Twitter was a wildfire of side-by-side comparisons. Victor as a boy in his prep school uniform, the smallest triplet in sneakers and a hoodie. The same eyes, the same jawline. On Instagram, amateur sleuths dissected every frame. One post zoomed in on Amara's wrist, speculating about the vintage gold bracelet. Another pointed out that the children's curls matched Victor's late mother's hair texture. Comments poured in. They're his. Look at those faces. Isn't his fiancée pregnant? Plot twist. The ex-wife he dumped came back with the real heirs. The PR war room in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of Hale International. Victor's PR team was already in damage control mode. Lydia Chun, his chief communications officer, tossed a printout of the gossip blog post onto the table. This has legs, she said, voice clipped. The resemblance is already going viral. Victor leaned back in his chair, jaw set. We issue no comment. That works if you're a Hollywood actor, Lydia shot back. You're a CEO? Silence implies guilt. Your investors are already calling. The stock is down 2 points since the open. From the corner, his fiancée, Sloane Prescott, sat stiff-backed in an ivory-sheathed dress, her phone clutched like a lifeline. She'd barely spoken since walking in. Finally, she said, "Is she the one you were married to?" Victor didn't answer right away. "Yes," he said at last. "And I haven't seen her in 6 years." Sloane's gaze flicked to the photos again. And those children? His silence stretched just long enough for Lydia to cut in. Legally, there's nothing connecting them to Victor. Sloane's eyes narrowed. Legally, the board's concerned. By lunchtime, a conference call with Hale International's board was underway. The voices on the speakerphone were sharp, impatient. "We can't have questions about succession planning right now," one board member barked. "Not with the Asian expansion deal in play. Address it publicly," another urged. "Or privately settle whatever this is." Victor rubbed his temples. He hated being cornered. "I'll handle it," he said. The hunt begins. Meanwhile, in Marseille, Amara's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She hadn't even known about the photos until Lila, her closest friend, sent a frantic text. "Are you seeing this?" The link opened to her own face staring back at her from a glossy gossip site. Her stomach dropped. Within hours, 2 reporters had called the gallery's landline. By evening, 3 men with cameras were standing across the street from her building, pretending to browse a bakery menu. By morning, they weren't pretending anymore. She spotted one of them crouched behind a parked car when she walked the boys to school. The flash went off, startling the smallest triplet into tears. "Enough," she snapped, stepping in front of the children. "Leave us alone." But the man just lowered his camera and said, "Can you confirm if the children's father is Victor Hale?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence would be twisted into whatever story they wanted. The fiancé cracks back in New York. Sloane wasn't faring well under the sudden spotlight. Her phone was flooded with messages from friends and acquaintances, all dripping with the same sugar-coated poison. "Are you okay, babe? Must be hard seeing his past like that." She confronted Victor in his penthouse that night. "Tell me they're not yours," she said, standing in the middle of the living room, the city lights spilling in behind her. Victor loosened his tie. "I can't tell you that." Her lips parted, but no words came. "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I never knew she was pregnant." Sloane laughed once, sharply. "And now you're telling me the woman you left is back, with heirs who might replace me before I even walk down the aisle?" He stepped closer. "This changes nothing between us." Her look said she didn't believe him. The call 2 days after the airport, Amara's phone rang from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Amara." His voice was exactly as she remembered, low, deliberate, like every word had already been measured before it reached her. "You have some nerve," she said. "We need to talk," he replied. "This is already out of control." "You mean?" "Your control," she shot back. "I'm offering to make this easier for you," he said. She laughed bitterly. "Easier?" You have reporters camped outside my home. My children are being photographed on their way to school. This isn't about making my life easier. It's about making yours cleaner." There was a pause. "If we don't handle this, others will. You know how this world works." She ended the call without saying goodbye. The breaking point: by the end of the week, the story had moved from gossip sites to mainstream business news. Financial analysts speculated on how an heir scandal could impact Hale International's leadership stability. On a morning news panel, a commentator said, "If those children are his, and they're not publicly acknowledged, this could raise serious questions about his integrity." Investors hate uncertainty. For Amara, the noise became inescapable. A reporter followed her into the grocery store. Another ambushed her outside the gallery, shoving a microphone toward her face as she tried to load the boys into a cab. The oldest triplet asked her that night, "Mama, why are people taking our picture?" She told him, "Because they're curious," and prayed he wouldn't ask more. At Victor's move, Victor's legal team drafted a statement, carefully worded, alluding to ongoing personal matters, without confirming anything. Lydia argued for release. Victor stalled. Instead, he made a different call. By Friday, a private investigator was in Marseille, sitting in a parked car across from the gallery, snapping photos and compiling notes. Victor didn't trust the media, but he trusted leverage. Amara's realization that night: Amara stood at her apartment window, watching the street below. She could see them, the men with cameras, the ones who didn't even bother to hide anymore. Her boys were asleep upstairs, their steady breathing the only thing anchoring her to the moment. 6 years, she'd kept their lives private. 6 years she'd built a wall so high she thought nothing could breach it. Now, with a single photograph, Victor had kicked in the door. And the worst part wasn't the media frenzy. The worst part was the sinking certainty that he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. The envelope was heavy, not in weight, though it was thick with embossed stationery, but in presence. It landed on Amara's gallery desk like a loaded weapon. Her assistant, Lena, hovered awkwardly, as if she'd just delivered a snake. "It came by courier," Lena said, eyes flicking to the gold crest embossed at the top. "No return address. But you can guess." Amara didn't need to guess. She recognized that crest, Victor Hale's personal seal. Before she even opened it, her fingers hovered over the flap for a long moment, nails grazing the smooth paper. She thought of her children's laughter drifting from the back room where they were painting. She thought of the sudden click of cameras at the airport. She thought of his face, white as marble when he saw her, his eyes locking on the triplets like a man seeing his sins carved into flesh. She broke the seal. "Amara, for the children's future, I believe we should speak privately. My office will arrange a meeting at your convenience. This is a matter that must be resolved discreetly." Victor Hale. The letter was short, calculated, and deliberately free of apology. He wasn't asking. He was summoning. Her lips curled, not in a smile, but something sharper: "for the children's future." That wasn't concern. That was control. Lena shifted from foot to foot. "What are you going to do?" Amara's eyes stayed on the page, but her voice was steady. "I'm going to remind Victor Hale that I am not a woman he gets to summon anymore." The meeting, however, was inevitable. By evening, her phone pinged with a follow-up email from a senior legal liaison for Hale Global Estates. Written in the same clipped tone, "Ms. Lewis." They still refused to acknowledge she'd ever been Mrs. Hale. "Mr. Hale requests a private meeting to discuss a matter of mutual concern. A neutral location will be arranged to ensure your comfort and discretion. Please advise of your availability." She stared at the email for a long moment before typing 2 words. "My terms." 2 days later, the neutral location turned out to be anything but. The restaurant was one of London's most exclusive, private dining suites hidden behind walls of velvet and oak, where deals worth billions were made between courses. Amara arrived early, deliberately choosing a seat where she'd have a clear view of the door. Her silk blouse was the color of deep wine. Her hair, swept into a sleek chignon, bared the strong line of her jaw. She would not show up looking like the woman he'd left, tired, pregnant, diminished. The door opened exactly on time. Victor Hale stepped in like a man who owned the air he breathed. His tailored navy suit was immaculate, his watch gleaming beneath the cuff. But Amara noticed something the paparazzi photos hadn't shown. His eyes were ringed with exhaustion, and his jaw was tight in a way that betrayed strain. Amara. He said her name like it was foreign in his mouth. Victor. Her tone was cool, almost bored. They sat. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the quiet chime of crystal water glasses being set down by a discreet waiter. "You've caused quite a spectacle," Victor said finally, leaning back, her brow arched. "I caused a spectacle? I didn't invite the photographers to Heathrow, Victor. I didn't stage your stunned reaction for the tabloids." His eyes flickered, just enough for her to know she'd hit the mark. "Those children," he said, his voice low, "look exactly like, they look exactly like themselves," she interrupted. "Beautiful, intelligent, whole, without you." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Amara, be reasonable. You've kept them hidden from me for years. I kept them safe from you," she snapped. Her voice was calm, but every word carried steel. "From your lawyers, from your elite circle, who would have treated them like an inconvenience at best and a scandal at worst." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I have a right to know my children." She leaned in too, meeting his gaze head on. "And I had a right to a husband who didn't humiliate me in public, who didn't trade in his wife for a shinier model while I was." She stopped herself, but the word hung in the air. "Pregnant." His eyes searched hers, as if still trying to understand how he'd missed it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, almost a whisper. Her laugh was short and sharp. "Because you'd already told me everything I needed to know." The silence after that was different. Not empty, but thick, like the air before a storm. When the food arrived, neither touched it. Victor's tone shifted, less confrontational, more calculated. "I don't want this to turn ugly," he said, his gaze steady. "But the media is already circling, and if they dig too deep, they'll hurt the children. I can offer security, privacy, education at the best schools. In exchange for what?" she cut in. Silence. "Signing their lives into your empire's PR machine." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "You always did think everything had a price," she said softly. "But my children aren't for sale." By the time they stood to leave, the tension had shifted from explosive to cold. He adjusted, his cufflinks, his voice measured. "Think about what's best for them, Amara. Because I will pursue this, and I will win." She stepped closer, her chin lifting until they were eye to eye. "You may win in court, Victor, but you will lose in the court that matters most, when they're old enough to ask why their mother had to fight you just to be left in peace." For a fraction of a second, something cracked in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or the sting of knowing she was right. Then it was gone, replaced by the impenetrable mask of the billionaire who had built an empire from nothing that he left first. She stayed behind, her hands steady on the table, even though her heart was pounding. She had faced him once. She could do it again, but she also knew the war had just begun. The courthouse smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and nerves. Amara sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded in her lap, every inch of her body rigid. Her black suit was tailored but not ostentatious. Sharp shoulders, clean lines, a statement without flash. Beside her, attorney Zora Whitfield leaned in, murmuring, "Remember, they'll try to get under your skin. Don't give them the performance they're hoping for." Amara nodded once, her eyes locked on the opposite side of the courtroom. Victor Hale, billionaire real estate mogul, ex-husband, betrayer, sat with the calm arrogance of a man accustomed to winning before the game even began. His legal team was a wall of suits, led by Stanton Greer, the silver-haired pit bull who'd gutted more opponents than anyone in the city's legal circuit. They were all white, all male, and all ready to grind her into the polished wood floor. She took a breath and thought of the triplets. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Meredith Langford, an immaculately dressed woman with an expression that could curdle milk, settled into her seat. "We're here on the matter of Victor Hale versus Amara Hale," she said crisply. "Petitioner is seeking establishment of paternity, joint custody, and visitation rights." The word stung like paper cuts to the heart. Establishment of paternity. As though the triplets' eyes, their jawlines, the way they frowned when concentrating, none of it counted. Greer stood. "Your Honor, the petitioner is simply seeking the truth for the sake of the children. Mr. Hale is prepared to step into his role as father, both financially and emotionally, but has been denied that opportunity due to Mrs. Hale's deliberate concealment." Amara's jaw tightened. Zora rose, her voice smooth but edged with steel. Your Honor, let's be clear, Mrs. Hale was abandoned by Mr. Hale while pregnant, subjected to relentless public humiliation, and left without support. She built a life for her children without interference. Mr. Hale's sudden concern seems less paternal and more opportunistic, coinciding conveniently with recent media exposure. The courtroom murmured. Victor's gaze stayed locked on Amara. Not angry, not gloating, studying. It unnerved her more than if he'd been openly hostile. She had the sensation he was calculating, mapping the battlefield in real time. Greer's first move was surgical. Mrs. Hale, is it true that after your divorce, you relocated overseas? Yes. And during that time, you opened an art gallery? Yes. Would you describe that gallery as financially successful? Amara hesitated. It was stable. Greer pounced. Stable? Our records show it operated at a loss for 3 consecutive years before closing. Zora objected. Irrelevant to the matter of custody, but the seed was planted. Greer was building the image of a financially unstable single mother, barely holding it together. He moved to living conditions. Isn't it true you lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 children? Yes, but so 3 children shared a single bedroom? Amara's mouth opened, but Zora touched her arm. We'll address that in our presentation. Greer smirked like a man who'd just taken the first city on a long campaign. When it was Zora's turn, the air in the room shifted. She rose with deliberate grace, approaching the witness stand as though approaching prey. Mrs. Hale, let's go back to the months before your divorce. Were you working at that time? Yes, I was an art curator. And why did you leave that position? Amara's eyes flicked to Victor. Victor's business was expanding. He asked me to handle the charity and cultural engagements for his company full-time. Said he needed someone he could trust. And did he compensate you for that work? No, did. You continue this unpaid work until the marriage ended. Yes. Zora turned to the judge. So, we have a woman who left her career to serve her husband's interests, unpaid, then was discarded while pregnant. And now, years later, after raising 3 children alone, she's being painted as financially unstable? This is not just an insult. It's an injustice. The room crackled with quiet tension. Victor shifted in his chair, leaning forward. Amara, you didn't tell me. You didn't give me the chance. She whipped her head toward him, voice low but sharp. You made your choice. You don't get to rewrite history now. Judge Langford's gavel rapped. Mr. Hale, you'll speak through counsel. But the damage was done. His outburst had cracked the polished surface he worked so hard to maintain. Zora pressed the advantage. Your Honor, my client did not conceal the children out of malice. She did so to protect them from a man whose loyalty shifted with public perception. And now that their existence has become a headline, he suddenly wishes to play father? The court must ask, who is truly being served here? The children or Mr. Hale's public image? Greer objected to this speculative and inflammatory statement, but Judge Langford allowed it to stand for now. As proceedings adjourned for the day, Amara gathered her papers with shaking hands. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving a hollowness in her chest. Victor stepped into her path near the exit. His voice was soft enough that only she could hear. I'm not letting you shut me out anymore. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing the man she once loved against the man who'd tried to destroy her. Then prepare yourself, Victor, she said quietly, because I'm not the same woman you walked away from. Zora appeared at her side, a steadying presence. Come on, she murmured, guiding her out into the cool evening. As they stepped onto the courthouse steps, the flash of cameras greeted them. Reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward. Amara kept walking, chin high, heart pounding. The battle lines had been drawn, and this time, she had no intention of losing. The courtroom air was thick with something Amara couldn't quite name. Anger, humiliation, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the journalists outside didn't need footage to make the public feel like they were there. Every whispered word in this place would be stretched, twisted, and headline-ready by the evening news she sat at. The plaintiff's table, her hands resting on the polished oak, knuckles pale against the dark grain. Across from her, Victor was the picture of wealth and control. Navy suit tailored within an inch of its life, silver cufflinks that caught the light, and that smug stillness of a man used to winning before the first blow was struck. But when his eyes flicked to her, she caught it, just for a fraction of a second. A crack. The same crack she'd seen at the airport. The same one that had widened with each day the public devoured their story. "Your Honor," Victor's lead counsel, a lean man with an ice-chip smile, rose. "We have submitted new evidence, documented proof of Ms. Hale's financial instability during her years abroad." He said it slowly, savoring each syllable. "This is directly relevant to the children's welfare." Amara's attorney, Layla Grant, didn't move right away. She stood only after the judge nodded, her posture unshaken, her tone carrying the confidence of a woman who had built her career dismantling rich men's facades. "Your Honor," Layla began, her eyes cutting toward the jury, "what Mr. Hale's counsel conveniently calls financial instability is the reality millions of single mothers live through every day. It is not neglect, it is survival. And survival is something my client excelled at, without the benefit of Mr. Hale's billions." Amara's stomach tightened. Layla's voice had that sharp edge again, steel wrapped in velvet. She was getting ready to cut that Victor's lawyer pressed on. "We have hotel records, credit statements, months where Ms. Hale was behind on rent. Is this the example the children deserve?" Layla didn't flinch. "Shall we also submit the evidence of Mr. Hale's corporate shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands? The ones used to conceal earnings during his last merger? Because if we're discussing what the children deserve, perhaps we start with their father's financial honesty." The air shifted. Victor's jaw ticked once. The judge, an older man with a habit of rubbing his temple when irritated, sighed. "Stick to the matter at hand, Ms. Grant." Layla inclined her head, but the damage was done. Whispers rippled through the spectators. The jurors leaned forward. Amara's chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately. She had promised herself she wouldn't look at him, but she did. Just once. Victor was staring straight ahead, but she could see his fingers tightening around his pen, the smallest tremor running through them. The cross-examinations that followed felt like knives, slow, deliberate, and personal. The opposition dredged up her time in Paris the months after. The triplets were born. They painted her modest apartment as squalid, her work at the gallery as unstable. Every question was a blade meant to strip her dignity. "You didn't tell Mr. Hale he had children, correct?" The lawyer asked. "That's correct." "You deprived him of the opportunity to be a father?" "I protected my children from being pawns." "Pawns, or from having access to their rightful inheritance?" The jury's heads turned toward her, waiting for the counterpunch. "I protected them," Amara said, voice steady, "from being raised by a man who could walk out on their mother when she needed him most." A low murmur filled the room before the judge banged his gavel. When it was Layla's turn, she went for Victor's soft spots with surgical precision. "Mr. Hale, can you explain your relationship with Ms. Kensington?" Victor's expression hardened. "She's my fiancée." "Your current fiancée," Layla clarified. "Isn't it true that your romantic relationship with her began while you were still married to my client?" "That's not. Isn't it also true that 2 weeks before you filed for divorce, you wired Ms. Kensington $200,000. Gasps broke out. Even the court reporter paused mid-typing that Victor's lawyer objected. "Relevance. Pattern of character, Your Honor," Layla shot back. The same character at issue when discussing the environment in which these children would be raised. The objection was overruled by the end of the day. The courtroom felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a battlefield littered with fragments of their marriage. There were moments when Amara almost forgot the venom between them, when an old photograph was passed around for evidence, showing them in Santorini, her hand on his chest, both of them laughing. For a flicker of time, she remembered the Victor who whispered about dreams at midnight, who touched her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever known. But then she remembered the empty bed, the unsigned note, the cold announcement in the press that their marriage was over. That memory burned away any softness. The judge dismissed the court for the day. Victor rose, buttoning his jacket with deliberate slowness. He didn't approach her, but his voice carried as he leaned toward his lawyer. "She's not taking them from me," he said, knowing she'd hear it. Amara stood, slipping her handbag over her shoulder, and without turning, replied just loud enough, "They were never yours to take." The click of her heels echoed through the silent courtroom as she walked out, the door swinging shut behind her like the final note of a gavel strike. The courtroom was too bright. The kind of sterile, relentless brightness that flattened every shadow, made no room for secrets. Amara sat at the witness stand, palms damp against the wood. The hum of the air conditioning was a low, constant static. Across the aisle, Victor's legal team perched like vultures, sharp suits, sharper smiles. And there he was, in the middle of them, immaculate as ever. But his jaw was tight, his fingers restless against his cufflink. "Mrs. Hale," the judge's voice was measured, almost gentle. "You may begin your testimony." Amara adjusted the microphone. Her own reflection stared back at her in the glass pitcher on the table, eyes tired but steady. "My name is Amara Hale," she began, her voice firm, "and I am the mother of the 3 children at the center of this case." There was a subtle rustle in the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but she could still feel the press breathing at the door. Her attorney, Celine Grant, gave a small nod. "Amara," she prompted softly, "tell us about your pregnancy." The first inhale burned. The words had been buried for years, but pulling them up felt like unearthing bones. "I was alone," Amara said finally. "Not just without a partner. Alone in the way you are when every door you thought was open suddenly slams shut." She looked straight at Victor. "I had just found out I was expecting, and the man I thought would be my family," her voice dipped, not breaking but heavy, "was engaged to someone else within weeks." Victor's jaw flexed. His lawyer scribbled something on a yellow legal pad. "During that time," Celine asked, "what support, financial, emotional, any, did you receive from Mr. Hale?" Amara's laugh was short, bitter. "None. Not a cent. Not a word. I didn't even tell him I was pregnant, because I knew what he would do. Or worse, what he wouldn't do." Celine's eyes narrowed. "And what do you mean by that?" Amara took a breath. "When you've seen someone smile at you one moment, then walk past you like you're a stranger in the next, you understand the cruelty of indifference. I didn't want my children to feel that." The jury's expressions were taut, unreadable, but one woman in the back row shifted uncomfortably. Celine stepped closer. "Can you describe what those first months were like for you?" The images came fast. Too fast. Nights when I couldn't sleep because the apartment was too quiet. Mornings when I'd wake to the sound of my own crying. I was in another country by then, so I didn't even have family nearby. I worked. God, I worked. Through morning sickness and swollen ankles. Because prenatal care isn't free, and neither is rent. She paused, swallowing. People in Victor's world, they made sure I knew I didn't belong there. I heard the whispers, the looks. Being a black woman in those circles, married to a man they thought should have chosen differently, it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was war, dressed in pearls and tailored suits. The judge glanced over his glasses at the defense table. Celine's tone softened. "Amara, did you ever think about going back?" Telling him. "No," Amara said simply. "Because I made a promise. Not just to myself, but to them." She turned her head toward the gallery, toward where her children were waiting outside the courtroom doors. "I promised they'd never have to beg for his love. If he wanted to be in their lives, he'd have to fight for it." The defense attorney stood. "Objection, Your Honor, speculation." Overruled, the judge said without looking up. Celine stepped aside, giving Amara the floor. "Tell the court about raising 3 children alone." Amara exhaled, the air catching in her chest. She smiled faintly. "It's waking up at 3 a.m. because one of them has a fever, and you're trying to remember if you paid the electricity bill before the fridge stops working. It's working double shifts at the gallery so you can afford school uniforms, and then showing up at parent-teacher meetings with makeup smudged because you ran there from the train. It's putting your own hunger second because they need lunch money, learning to braid hair while half asleep, knowing you can't afford to get sick because you are the safety net." The room was silent. Even Victor's lawyers had stilled their pens. "And yet," she continued, "it's the most powerful thing I've ever done. They're not my burden. They're my rebellion. They're proof that I survived the worst thing a person I loved could do to me, and still built something beautiful." Her voice didn't waver now. "Motherhood wasn't my sacrifice. It was my victory." The judge's gavel tapped once, not to interrupt, but to mark the moment. Celine's eyes glinted. "No further questions." The Defense attorney rose, slow and deliberate. Mrs. Hale, would you say you made a conscious choice to keep the children's paternity a secret? Yes, Amara said without hesitation. Even knowing Mr. Hale might have wanted to be a father? She tilted her head. If he wanted to be a father, he could have been a husband first. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The lawyer leaned forward, voice cool. Or perhaps you didn't want to share them because you needed to maintain control. Because you, objection, argumentative, Celine cut in, sustained. The defense lawyer shifted tactics. Isn't it true, Mrs. Hale, that you lived in subsidized housing for a period while abroad? Yes, Amara said evenly. Because I was supporting 3 children on my own without access to the wealth I helped create. And I still kept them safe, healthy, and loved. Can Mr. Hale say the same? The lawyer opened his mouth, then shut it again. When she stepped down from the stand, the gallery's collective inhale felt like a tide going out. Celine touched her arm lightly. You just told them the story they'll remember, Celine whispered. Amara nodded. And for the first time since the trial began, she didn't feel like she was on defense. She felt like she was finally heard. The air in the courtroom felt charged, as if the walls themselves had absorbed every whispered insult, every gasp, every silent tear from the trial. Cameras were banned inside, but Amara could feel the press just beyond the heavy oak doors, their hunger for the outcome almost tangible. She sat rigid beside her attorney, Layla, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Victor sat across the aisle, immaculate in a tailored navy suit, his jaw locked in that way she remembered, an expression that once meant, I'm in control. Now, though, there was something else there. A flicker of doubt. The judge shuffled the papers, her voice steady but heavy with finality. In the matter of paternity, the court finds sufficient evidence to establish that Victor Hale is the biological father of the minors in question. The words landed like a punch. Amara's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She could feel the triplets' presence in her mind, their faces, their laughter, their stubborn little streaks that were all hers. This was never about denying who their father was. It was about protecting them from what their father could be, the judge continued. However, due to documented evidence of prior misconduct, repeated absences during critical periods, and credible testimony regarding neglect and emotional harm, the court denies primary custody to Mr. Hale. Joint legal custody is granted, but full physical custody remains with Ms. Amara Johnson. A murmur rippled through the room. On Victor's side, his lead counsel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. On Amara's side, Layla allowed herself the smallest of smiles, professional, controlled, but victorious. Victor didn't look at Amara. He looked at the floor. For the first time, Amara saw him not as the man who'd shattered her life, but as someone tasting real loss for the first time. This wasn't about money. He could lose billions and still live like a king. But this? Losing the chance to rewrite history. With the children who bore his eyes? That would haunt him. The gavel struck, and just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. The steps were a frenzy. Reporters shouting questions, flashes going off like lightning, microphones shoved toward her face. Amara, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you believe Victor will appeal? What's next for you and the children? Layla stepped forward like a shield, her voice calm but cutting through the chaos. Ms. Johnson has no comment at this time. But Amara did have a comment, one. She kept locked behind her smile. We survived. From the corner of her eye, she saw Victor emerge, flanked by his PR team. His fiancée, a willowy blonde who had been glued to his side in earlier hearings, was nowhere to be seen. In fact, Amara had heard whispers, confirmed by one of Layla's contacts, that she'd moved out of his penthouse just days ago. The press pounced on him. Mr. Hale, is it true your board is voting to remove you as CEO? Sources say your main investors are pulling out. Care to comment? Did you lie to your fiancé about the triplets? Victor didn't answer. He kept walking, jaw tight, his world shrinking with every step. 2 days later, the headlines were merciless: billionaire father who lost his own children. Inside the courtroom drama, Hale Industries stock plummets 17%. Investors question leadership, a man without a legacy. Victor Hale's empire surged. The photographs were worse. One caught him at the exact moment the verdict was read. Eyes glassy, lips pressed into a line. Another showed Amara leaving the courthouse, the triplets clutching her hands, the sunlight hitting her face like a benediction. The caption read, "A mother's quiet victory." Amara didn't celebrate. Back in her modest home, she fixed the kids their favorite dinner, mac and cheese with steamed broccoli on the side. They had no idea of the storm they'd just lived through. She wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. After tucking them in, she sat on the edge of her bed and let herself feel everything: relief, exhaustion, grief for the years stolen, pride for the strength she didn't know she had. Her phone buzzed with messages, friends congratulating her, strangers sending love, offers from publishers and documentary producers. She ignored them all, but one message made her pause. That IT was from Victor. "You won. But this isn't over." She stared at it for a long moment before deleting it. He was wrong. For her, for the children, it was over. And that was enough. The next morning, she walked the kids to school. Parents in the drop-off line gave her nods of solidarity. Some smiled, some whispered, but no one dared question her now. When she turned to leave, a black SUV sat idling at the corner. For a split second, her heart clenched, but it drove away without stopping. She exhaled, sunlight warming her face. The war had taken years from her life, but it had given her something Victor could never reclaim: the right to tell her own story, and the power to decide how it ended. Amara adjusted her coat, squared her shoulders, and walked on. The airport hum was different this time. It wasn't the frantic shuffle of escape or the hollow ache of running from ghosts. This was lighter, like the sound of a door softly closing behind her while another cracked open ahead. Amara adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, glancing at the three little faces gathered around her. The triplets had grown in ways only a mother would notice. New words picked up, secret codes between them, the way their laughter now fit together like a cord. They tugged at her hands, their small carry-on bags bumping along the polished floor. This was the day. The departure board flickered above her. Lisbon, 10:35 a.m. A city where no one knew the headlines, where no cameras would lurk behind taxi doors, and where her children could simply be children. She had imagined this moment during sleepless nights, back when her life was being dissected by courtroom glare and tabloid venom. Now it was here. "Mommy," Ezra piped up, "do they have the kind of ice cream you like in our new home?" Amara smiled, brushing her fingers over his curls. "Better," she said softly. "They have the kind that melts too fast in the sun." They laughed, the sound echoing off the high glass ceiling. Somewhere behind them, a familiar set of footsteps slowed. She didn't turn, but her chest knew before her eyes did. Victor, he wasn't the man who used to command a room with the weight of his name. His suit hung looser, the once polished cufflinks dull. The sharpness in his gaze had softened into something almost human. If their first meeting at this airport years ago had been a wound, this one was an afterimage, a faded scar. She turned then, catching his eyes. There was no anger there, no war to be fought, just a quiet understanding that some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt, no matter how desperately one stares at the smoke. "You're leaving," he said, voice steady, but low enough that the triplets wouldn't hear. "Yes," she replied. No explanations, no apologies. Victor's eyes shifted to the children, his children, who were giggling over something on Amara's phone. He took a slow step forward, but stopped before reaching them, as though there were an invisible line on the floor he wasn't allowed to cross. "They look happy," he said. "They are," Amara replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "That's the point." There was a beat of silence between them, filled with all the words they'd never say. He could have told her about the investors who pulled out, the board members who whispered behind closed doors, the tabloid headlines that had reduced him from titan to scandal. She could have told him about the nights she spent holding a baby in each arm, her back aching, staring at the ceiling and swearing she'd never let anyone close enough to hurt them again. But neither of them spoke those truths. Instead, Victor nodded, as if sealing a private treaty neither would put in writing. "Take care of them," he murmured. "I always have," she said, stepping back. Her boarding group was called. The triplets scrambled to gather their things, one of them squealing about window seats. Amara guided them toward the gate, her steps light, her heart steady. Halfway down the jet bridge, she glanced over her shoulder. Victor was still there, watching, Not as a billionaire, not as a man trying to win a fight, but as someone finally realizing the cost of everything he had lost, the kind of realization that comes too late. She turned back to her children, crouching to their level. "You ready for our adventure?" They nodded eagerly, eyes bright. The airplane door loomed ahead, white and rounded like the entrance to something entirely new. As they stepped inside, Amara felt the weight she'd carried for years lift, piece by piece, until there was only the quiet thrill of the unknown. When the plane began to taxi, the triplets pressed their faces to the window. Amara didn't look. Outside, she didn't need to see Victor standing alone in that terminal. She kept her gaze forward, toward the aisle stretching ahead, toward the sky that would soon open for them. Her freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't about winning headlines or humiliating anyone. It was this, choosing her own ending. And as the plane lifted, leaving the city and its shadows behind, Amara closed her eyes and smiled. Not out of spite, not even out of victory, but because, for the first time in years, she was finally, completely free.